Welcome to Vision to Value, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how technology is planned, purchased, and implemented in state government health and human services agencies. Each episode explores the real challenges of transformation, from procurement pitfalls to leadership strategies, and provides bold insights to drive meaningful change. Your hosts, Carole, Hussey, and Tony Mathews, bring decades of experience from both public and private sector leadership. Together, Carole and Tony bring unfiltered insights and straight talk on what works, what doesn't, and how agencies and vendors can turn vision into real value. Now let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Vision to Value. We hope you enjoyed our previous episode where we had our special guest, Wayne Glaus, and we talked a lot about leadership. After that meeting, Tony and Wayne and I were sort of debriefing, and we talked a lot about leadership and the importance of leadership right now. And so we're pivoting a little bit from what we had previously planned to do this week. And we want to talk about a topic that's really timely and critical right now. And it's a great follow on to our previous conversation about leadership. So today we're going to talk about how state and local leaders can prepare for HHS policy shifts under the new Trump administration. And these policy shifts have a lot of implications, which we'll talk about today. Since Trump has taken office, and it's only been a little over a month too. Like that's kind of like everything that's happened. It feels like it's been longer than that, but it's just been a little over a month. And we've already seen some very significant number of executive orders, and the changes are really swift and wide ranging, right? Not news to any of you if you're all paying attention to the news. And we can expect that more change is coming. And so what we're going to talk about today is how best to adapt to the change, to influence change, and to protect the services that communities have come to rely on. We're seeing a lot in the news about that, and a big fear about our ability, all of us who are committed to health and human services in particular, to be able to continue to deliver those critical services and supports in your communities. So we're going to talk about that. These new priorities and new funding decisions and regulations are going to have big changes. So that you can expect. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about, kind of how to prepare for that without having a crystal ball, right? So Tony, let's just spend a couple of quick minutes here. One advantage we have, right, or I think with the Trump administration is he was president before. And so, looking back at his administration or previous Republican administrations, what kind of policy themes or changes, based on historic, perspective might we expect with this new leadership team?
Well, I think some of the big stuff is sort of obvious, right? I mean, I think this administration has showed that individual accountability is a premium, right? So I think they're less inclined to sort of make more robust benefit packages and more inclined to want to have work requirements and make sure that the due diligence is being done for, eligibility determination. So I think there are certain sort of tenets of the previous Trump administration that I think we can expect will either continue or will be enhanced versus what it was last time.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing too is the administration seems to be very big on giving more autonomy to states. So I think as we go through this conversation today, and there's a lot to cover, we're gonna have to talk fast to get through in 30 minutes. But I think Medicaid is going to be a little bit of a different animal than everybody else. I think that's got its own set of challenges. So you're almost talking about regular human services type, benefits, a little bit different than Medicaid. I think Medicaid is going to have an even more strict sort of set of requirements around it with this administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously we're hearing a lot about efficiency, right? That's the word of the day, right? How can we be more efficient? And you think about like private sector business, that's a thing that all organizations strive for. You think about like Lean Six Sigma and things like that, is how can we operate as efficiently as possible to improve our bottom line, right? And so it really is where they're headed in terms of efficiency, cost savings, and all of that. in response to, obviously a growing population of people that wanted that and voted for that. So we'll see more of that. And so one of the things that I'm starting to see in some of the states is sort of this fear, almost paralyzing, like we don't know what's coming, so we're just going to wait. So let's talk a little bit, Tony, about why waiting is not an option and why that's not a good idea.
Well, it ties back to efficiency too. I mean, I don't want to lose the point you made with efficiency. Sometimes speed, trying to do things quickly, can actually be detrimental to being efficient. And I think we're seeing that with some of the federal layoffs. It's one thing to say, okay, you've got till the end of the week to respond to, your job being, are you taking the buyout or are you going to justify your position? But the logistics of doing that in a way that's compliant with all the regulations around it, you end up backtracking. If you try to go too fast without a lot of direction, without a lot of guidance or clarification, then you end up going slower because you have to redo things. And I think that's going to be a theme today too, is agility. I'm going to probably say 10 times today. You've got to be able to move quick enough to get what needs to be done, but you also have to do it in a way that's going to be compliant. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I think, especially with state block grants and that sort of thing, if you make a mistake, then you end up paying for that mistake with state dollars. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be very, very clear on the front end what the guidelines are, what the compliance requirements are going to be, so that way you can implement any changes accurately and in a compliant way to where the state doesn't get nicked for it on the back end because they didn't do it correctly.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and we'll talk a little bit about that too, kind of as information becomes available, you make more and more informed decisions, but sometimes you're going to make a decision knowing what you know, and then you might have to pivot a little later. Right. Yeah. And I think we're going to talk about that. But yeah, I think you said these words, Tony, so I want to make sure you get credit for it, is that uncertainty is a leadership test, right? It really is. It's in these uncertain, it's a lot easier to be a great leader when you can predict everything and things are stable. But our true test of leadership comes when things aren't great or things are rocky. And so we're seeing that now. And, reactive leaders scramble, right? Proactive leaders, which we're going to talk about today, are anticipating. They're planning. You're going to plan for worst case, best case, and a variety of models in between, so that you can position your agency to adapt and also to take advantage of potential opportunities that might come from some of these changes as well.
Yeah, and part of being proactive, I think, is it's not anticipating what the policy changes may be. It's being able to be agile enough and to be ready to deal with sort of ambiguity, mm-hmm. right? And we talked about it as we got ready for this, for this episode. You can, the frontline staff are going to be, wringing their hands about what the changes are coming, and is what I'm doing a waste of time if it's going to change down the road, and they get very frustrated, and it's very intense. And as a leader, you've got to be able to sort of acknowledge that there's changes coming. It's status quo until you hear from us, right? We're working with the administration at the state level. We're talking to our federal partners. We're talking to the groups, the NASPOs of the world and the APHSAs of the world, to where we're trying to, let us worry about the bridge, that's 10 miles down the road and what's going on with that. You worry about the potholes. Right. Mm-hmm. We've used this analogy before. So I think that's a critical part of this is a good leader will sort of intercept that ambiguity and that sort of, uncertainty that the staff is going to feel, acknowledge it, but let them know, hey, just keep doing your day job, just exactly the way you're doing it today. Because a lot of times we see legislation gets submitted that's radical in the changes that may come, but what actually passes a lot of times is much different than what was submitted. And you can't run around like a chicken with your head cut off, worried about what might happen. You just need to be prepared in the right way for what changes may actually come out at the end.
Yeah.
and you can't overreact to what's proposed because the end result may be a lot different.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But yeah, you mentioned, engaging with and leveraging national associations like NASPO, APHSA, National Governors Association. There are a number of organizations like this that you might be connected with as a leader in a government organization. What are some other ways that a leader can, try to track some of those early signals out of Washington and kind of look around the corner to be prepared?
Well, like most things, it comes down to relationships, right? Have you built those relationships with your federal partners? Because they will be hearing things at their level that some of which they can share with you, some they can't. But if you've got a good rapport and you've been sort of keeping in touch with your federal partners at the program level, even, that can sort of help you. They'll say, if your state is smart, you'll start looking at cleaning up your data, or you'll start looking at integrated eligibility, because we're hearing more and more that, that's going to be where they're going to really focus. And you can get way ahead of the curve just by interacting with your federal partners. I think the other thing, too, is you need to have a good relationship with your administration to where they understand that the implications of policy changes aren't necessarily a quick turnaround. You may not have the right software to make that sort of a radical change. You may not have the bandwidth with your IT team to make eligibility changes that need to be made in a timely fashion. And so I think you've got to start sort of prepping your administration for, hey, we know changes are coming. We're doing the things we know to do to sort of be agile.
Mm-hmm.
However, if they say, some major change needs to happen by the end of the next month, just know that that may not be enough time to
Right.
actually do that correctly, and maybe check in with us if you have an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not you think it's a good idea. Check in with us, and we'll give you some good feedback about whether or not that's doable or not.
Yeah. Yeah, because quite often we get short notice and vague directions, right, of what's expected. And, a lot of times the people in these other leadership positions in your governor's office or legislators, they don't really understand level of effort, right, to be able to make some of these changes and some of the complications associated with that. And so, as we're looking at these executive orders, policy memos, and we're talking to, key leaders in these other organizations, one of the things that we talked about was like doing some type of an impact assessment, right? Like you mentioned getting your data together. Um, Expand on that, and then tell us a little bit about some of the other things that you might look at if you were doing an impact assessment to prepare for what might happen.
Well, I think it's all the sort of common sense things. One is, you probably already know where you're weak. You already know if you've got 30 years worth of data, and anytime you try to run a report, it's super slow because you've got all this redundant information or it's not been cleaned up. So some of that is just things you already know. You may as well bite the bullet and use this as an opportunity to sort of clean up the areas where you're already deficient. If
Mm-hmm.
you've got processes where, if Bob has a list in a county office that he puts in a drawer, and every Friday that's when he updates the volume of applications that week, okay, we probably need to get on top of that, because somebody's going to ask us, how many applications do you process a week? How many of those are denied? Of the ones that are denied, how many get appealed? Of the ones that are appealed, how many get overturned? And so if you already know some of these things, you may as well get in front of it now, because there's going to be some very quick turnarounds on what are the impacts. Your administration is going to ask, what's the impact of this change? And you
Mm-hmm.
need to make sure you've got the apparatus in place to be able to answer those questions. So it's data, it's processes, it's your IT team. Your IT team is already, probably everybody's busy, and they're already trying to support all of the changes you're already working on. And at some point, you're going to say, I need you to do this quickly. And the obvious question is going to be, okay, well then what are you going to deprioritize?
Yep.
If this goes to the top of the list and we've already got 10 things on the list that are important, you need to be prepared to explain to IT what you're going to bump because this change needs to happen sooner than later. So I think it's those sorts of conversations at sort of the leadership level to make sure, like I said, that you're running interference so the program people don't get bogged down with all these what if scenarios. You're doing your due diligence to make sure you're in the best possible position to be agile when those inevitable policy changes come down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned, we don't want to put undue burden on our staff or create more, consternation where people are already feeling anxious, right? I think when we were talking, preparing for today, you said you're going to identify, right? When you're identifying your resources, and we talked about NASBO and governor's office and legislature, but you're also going to identify a couple of key resources internal who are going to help you with this impact assessment and help you get the data ready and do all the things you just described. So like if you're a leader in a program office, like what kind of people do you need to help you with that? Who are you tapping?
So, most commissioners or executive directors of state departments have a chief of staff, right? A special projects person, right? Like you typically have one or two people that are your go-to ad hoc, whatever the flavor of the day is, you need them to stop what they're doing and work on this. And so I would say, you should be thinking now about freeing that person up or those people up to sort of take this on, to make sure that there's a point of contact between the leader of the department and the program staff, to make sure that all these things that we're talking about are put in motion, and they've got the authority to get a little traction on it without getting everybody riled up that their job is going to be changing. And you need sort of a go-to person to say, okay, find out where we are with the data. Is our data clean? Can we run reports accurately and quickly? Get with IT, right? Talk to the CIO, make sure that they're in touch with who they need to be to make sure we're prioritizing things and we're creating that bandwidth that we know we're going to need. So I think a good commissioner or executive director will have that sort of go-to person, and their task needs to be sort of preparing the department for the inevitable policy changes that are coming and doing the things you're going to need to do regardless of what the change is. There's certain things you're going to need to be able to do. Yeah. And so I think that's where leveraging that person or that capability is going to be important.
Yeah. A couple of times in my past experience too, I've seen states where they might even bring back in a previous director or deputy or somebody that really understands the programs and the policies, because this is a temporary crunch, right? You're going to need more resources in a short period of time. Sometimes you can tap somebody that retired but that knows the program, bring them back in to help, or get a consultant to come in and help you with some of these things as well. So you need to recognize that these are going to be big changes, right? And in some cases, you might need some additional help beyond what you have at your immediate disposal.
Yeah, I think the key is doing that in a way that's agile, right? Yeah. The last thing you want to do is add another layer of bureaucracy, another step, another person, and you don't know where they fit. So if you can do it in a way to where, like you said, it's somebody that they know, or it's a contractor you've used before that sort of knows the lay of the land, the last thing you want to do is bring in somebody who doesn't know the players, the processes, right? The history of the department, to where they're having to catch up and they're interviewing people to sort of get their legs under them. I think that might be a little less effective than if you've got somebody that understands the ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. And we've seen the speed with which these changes are coming right now. So you don't want to add additional layer there.
I love what's going on with the federal layoffs, because it really is a great example of you can try to run so fast that you trip over your own feet, and then you've got to get up and dust yourself off and start running again. And that's not an indictment of the administration. It's just that's the world we live in when it comes to a bureaucratic function. Is you really have to take a minute and think it through and do it in a very deliberate way if you're going to do it quickly. Napoleon or somebody said, "I'm in a hurry." Like it takes forever to get dressed, right? Back then, I'm in a hurry. Go slow.
Yeah.
Like I don't need you to have to rebutton something. Take your time and do it right the first time, and that'll be the quickest way. And
Yeah.
I think that's where we are with some of these changes. And I'm not sure there's a lot of patience for that. So it's that balancing act.
Yeah. Patience for the shifting, you mean? Like, so.
Patience for doing it right, going a little
Oh,
slower and
yeah.
doing it right so you don't have to do it again. I
Yeah.
think there's not a lot of patience for that.
Yeah.
We've seen this administration before, he wants to do it with an executive order. He wants to send an email to all the federal employees, justify your job by the end of the week. And let's do this.
Yeah.
And I think we all can appreciate that sentiment. We all have been in places in our careers where let's just get it done and not overthink it. But I think in some things you have to take a minute at the beginning and think it through so that you
Right.
don't trip over your own feet.
Right. So in the case of the layoffs, the intention was there, but without fully understanding the implications of, you don't have a budget approved past March, or, the other, impediments to that. And I think that's, as people who've worked in state government for a long time, you and I think we see this sometimes when people come in from private sector, and there's always this like, my goodness, why does it take so long to get things done? Well, it's not because we want it to take that long, right? There just are rules, regulations, policies, bureaucracies, politics, like all the things that if I'm the president of a company, I can come in tomorrow and do whatever I want. I don't have to adhere to all these other layers of challenges and impediments that we do in government, and I think we've seen that in a variety of examples. This one probably certainly more intense in terms of the number of examples.
Well, and we see that, and this will be relevant with human services. We see that with grants, right? It's easy to come in and say, "Hey, there's $18 billion in unutilized grants. We're just going to cancel those contracts, and we're going to save the federal government $18 billion." Makes sense. The problem is when when you're trying to do that, a lot of that $18 billion or whatever the number is that may not look like it's utilized. It just hasn't been. They're reporting quarterly or annually the expenses, drawing down the money from that grant.
Yeah.
And so it's, when you start looking at it, you realize, well, wait a minute, you can't just turn off the spigot because there are outstanding expenditures that have to be balanced that haven't been claimed yet against those grant awards. Mm-hmm. So even something just like that, in which I think that's coming too, right?
Yeah.
I know, there's a lot of unspent TANF money out there. And so I can see somebody easily saying, well, we could save a bunch of money if we reel in some of this TANF money that states aren't using. But, you've got to let the accounting process work to make sure that, okay, guys, at the end of the fiscal year, if you haven't claimed it, we're taking it back. Yeah. You've got to give states that opportunity to do their due diligence to make sure they're getting what they're entitled to before you just say, you haven't collected it yet, you're not getting it.
Yeah. And in some programs, there's just cycles, right? Cycles of use. And, it's not always a flat line of spending across a budget year. Let's talk a little bit about some of the stakeholders. So we mentioned engaging with the governor's office, legislature, federal partners. What are some other organizations that, when we're in the midst of these kinds of changes, that a leader should be thinking about proactively engaging with?
Well, I think about all your local stakeholders, right? I mean, and everybody's got a different take on it, right? Some stakeholders are only worried about homelessness, right? And the homeless, and they've got blinders on for anything else. They're not worried about the summer, feeding program. Others are only worried about job placement, right? And they're not worried about SNAP. So I think it's important to make sure that at whatever level you're engaged with your stakeholders, you're communicating with them that, hey, we know changes are coming. Please don't get worked up when you hear the initial whatever soundbite it is. There's going to be a 25% reduction in whatever. Let's wait. We're doing our due diligence to be able to address that, but let's wait to respond to that until we know what it actually is, not what the first salvo was that sort of put you on notice that you might be on the chopping block. So I think as long as your stakeholders know We know there's change coming. Here's what we've heard. Here's what we're doing to prepare for potential changes. We're trying to be agile. Please don't overreact until we get to that sort of tipping point where, okay, this is happening in one form or another. Here are the changes we need to make. So I think it's just a matter of sort of communicating, whether it's with your frontline staff or your stakeholders. Let them know you're thinking about it. You're worried about the bridge. There's going to be a change to the bridge. You don't know what it is yet, but there's going to be a change. As leaders, we are thinking that far down the road. So don't, feel confident that we're anticipating that and we're doing everything we can to prepare for it. I think that goes a long way. I think the absence of communication leads to speculation, and there can be, there are a few things that's detrimental to a culture as people that are just making stuff up because you're not telling them anything else.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully you already have built a culture of trust, right? And I think that goes back to our conversation from last week. But, if you start with that, hopefully you're in a little bit better position. We talked also, I don't think we mentioned it yet today, but like labor unions are really important in states where that exists. And that also kind of relates a little bit to HR in terms of roles and responsibilities and what kind of changes might come with that. Because, in a lot of health and human services programs, we were already experiencing workforce issues. And so if we're now cutting and looking at modifying roles and responsibilities associated with some of those cuts, there could be some big implications, right, in terms of like reskilling or negotiating union contracts and things like that as well. And so that's a whole different level, different type of communication that leaders need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. And, when you're talking about, health and human services agencies, there's so many funding mechanisms and ratios, whether it's admin, you've got, there's a cap on how much you can spend on admin.
Yep.
And, if they reduce your grant by 25%, your admin is going to go down 25%, and you're going to have to make some real choices and decisions about reallocating those people or eliminating positions or something else. The other things you were talking just now, Carole, that I thought about as we think about everybody who could be affected by potential changes, whether it's HR or IT or stakeholders or whoever, I'm putting my budget director hat on from back in the day. There are some departments besides yours that leverage the money you spend to meet some requirement that they have. I'll give you an example. Sometimes the money we would spend in human services, education could get credit for some sort of requirement that they had for a grant money that they had. And so that's another element of this too, is making sure that your fiscal or your budget staff understand they need to be thinking now about the interdependability, interactivity between your department and other departments financially. So that way, if there is a policy change, they know immediately, they reduced our SNAP award. We need to call Children's Services and let them know that amount is going down. They're going to have to adjust their formula. Or we have to call education because something else went down. So I do think that that's another thing you can do proactively as far as trying to be agile, is already know where there is interdependabilities, whatever word I'm trying to say, where that dependence is with other departments on yours, and probably vice versa. I mean, if education is going to be eliminated, which is the talk, right? There may be things that your department is dependent on with education spending. And so I think it's critical to map those things out. So when there's a change, you know who you need to talk to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you think about Medicaid, I mean, that's not just your Medicaid department, right? Medicaid funds a whole lot of different things, right? School-based programs for in-community services. They fund a lot, like homeless. There were a whole lot of waivers, right? That funded things like housing for people in recent years. So, are those things going to be cut? So make sure you're looking outside of your own agency to where those funds are rolling. Yeah.
You should be mapping that out today. You should know what other departments you're dependent on, and then what departments are dependent on you. And so that way, whether it's happening to someone else and it affects you, or it's happening to you and it affects somebody downstream. your team should already be mapping that out like today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking about waivers the other day, right? Because
Yeah.
that's like you said, know what's in your waiver.
Yeah.
Because we saw that happen in child welfare several years ago when they used to have the 4E waivers and they just cut them. And some
Yep.
states were affected more significantly than others, like pretty big impacts. And so if they opt to go down that path, you should know what the implications of that are for sure.
And when it comes to waivers, especially like a Medicaid type waiver, working with your administration within your state, the governor's office, and making sure that if there's some radical policy change that's inconsistent with your waiver, but your governor, your administration feels good that that waiver is the best way to administer those dollars, be prepared to have those conversations and be prepared to push back. I think a lot of departments just feel like they're held hostage by the federal government, and any changes that come down, that get submitted or implemented, that they're stuck with. They have to just make it happen. But if it's something that's nonsensical to the tone and tenor of what you're trying to do with those dollars, be willing to have the conversation with the governor's office about maybe pushing back and
Mm-hmm.
say, look, we know what you're trying to do and why. We feel like our waiver accomplishes that. I'm not sure if you realize it or not, but this change that you're suggesting is going to make that less effective instead of more effective. So we would like to be, held harmless on that and be
Mm.
willing to push back. Because I think a lot of times we just react to it is what it is. That's what the Fed said. We have to do it. But if you feel strongly that that's not the way to go and your administration's on board, you can always have that conversation with them and say, look, we like to keep doing it the way we're doing it for these reasons.
Yeah, and I think it is fair and expected that we would be advocating for our state's needs, right? With the feds, with our legislators. We are the voice of the constituents who are being served in any jurisdiction. But I do think it goes back to having the data to back you up. And,
Yeah.
some states struggle with this more than others, but if you're going to push back, you better have a strong justification for that. So if
Yep.
something's getting cut that you can prove through data that has had a significant impact on whatever it may be, right? Outcomes improvement, efficiencies, cost savings. When we look at, health and human services, the overall cost of care per person, right? If we cut here, maybe we're going to increase, needs over here. And so what does that look like when we're looking at things like social determinants of health?
Yeah.
And you talk about it in that way. Do you have that data to support what you're asking them to change or to do differently?
Well, and I mean that's a great point. The thing I think when you mention that, I think about childcare. We want to, the administration wants to do work requirements, right? We want people to be independent. We want them to pull their weight, to earn the benefits that they get. But if you don't have childcare, you can't work. You can't get
Yeah.
a job that works 40 hours, or you can't take a third shift job because there's no childcare available on third shift. And so I think childcare is one of those that sort of pops to mind right away. Is that
Mhm.
you can't just reduce the childcare award. Most states are trying to increase the childcare capacity in their state to make it easier for people to go to work.
Yeah. And there was a lot of progress on that front post COVID, right?
Yeah.
And we saw a lot of states leveraging ARPA money and other funds to be able to build up the technology solutions to support that. I mean, those programs were historically underfunded from a federal perspective. And so we've made this progress. And now if we start pulling back, what is that going to look like? Are we going to, did we do enough to shore it up, or are we going to see implications associated with that? I mean, I would think any cuts is going to have an impact, but that is definitely one of the things that we see impacts housing. It impacts mental health and substance abuse and all of those
Sure.
other areas
Sure.
that yet you take away the child care, you're going to see it, impact in these other areas for sure.
Well, and I mean, I think it goes back to the point you're just making about sort of making the argument, if you want to do it a different way, you have to be able to support that. Know your audience, right? So you can't say, we want to do it this way because it's the right thing to do, or
Right.
because, our people need it. When you have, this administration, you're going to have to make a business justification for why you want to do things.
Mhm.
So, we try to stay pretty agnostic here. Whether you're a red state or a blue state, the red state it should be easier for them to sort of be making the argument for, this is going to save money by spending these millions of dollars. It's going to save these other millions of dollars over here. So that's pretty easy. I worry a little bit about some of the blue states that may think, well, it's a no-brainer. People need childcare. We should do it because it's the right thing and they deserve it. Know your audience, right?
Yeah.
That's probably not a good business justification with a Republican administration.
Yeah.
So have your numbers, be able to make the business justification with this administration. The last administration, you probably could argue that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But with this administration, you better be able to use numbers to make your case.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, that half hour flew by quickly, as we knew it would. But as we kind of close out this episode, Tony, what kind of key takeaways would you leave folks with in thinking about, kind of looking for the bridge, right? To use your analogy, how are we gonna, recommend to leaders to prepare for all this change that is afoot, right?
I think it comes down to relationships, right? Whether it's with your own administration, with your federal partners, with your stakeholders. I think you've got to make sure, if you're not already, be reinforcing those relationships, leveraging some of these national organizations that this is all they do. They monitor legislation. They're monitoring, budget appropriations. Leverage them. They don't expect everybody in all 50 states to be doing it themselves. You're paying a membership due to those organizations. Leverage them to the extent you can. And then I think the third biggest thing is communication,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's with the people we just talked about or your own staff. But I think you're making a mistake if you don't let your staff know globally that we know change is coming. We're doing all the things we can think of to prepare for what might come. Don't stress about it. We are,
Mm-hmm.
and we will communicate with you when there is something to act on. So until then, don't worry about it. We're worrying about it for you.
Yeah. We had talked about, and we didn't mention it earlier, I'll just leave it quickly, is creating or architecting a communications hierarchy, right? Because we,
Mm.
we mentioned a lot of stakeholders today. And the kinds of things you need to talk about with your governor's office is different than you're going to talk about with the labor union. And it's not because you're hiding anything, but it's because the needs are different. And that's also different than what you're going to talk about with your supervisors or your workers, or your providers. So just think about that. It's not a one size fits all in terms of communications. You communicate what's appropriate, when it's appropriate, and to whom it's appropriate. And that requires planning and thought.
Yeah, and the last thing you want is to give a quote to the newspaper or TV station that you didn't vet with the governor's office, if that's something that they expect.
Yeah.
And so hopefully most departments in most states have already worked that out to where they know what they can say independently and what they need to get blessed before they communicate it. But yeah, you need to have your ducks in a row ahead of time.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the one last thing we'll leave you with is waiting is not an option, right? This is coming. The train is moving fast. So anything you can do to sort of get ahead of that, you're going to be glad you did. Sitting back and waiting is not going to be an effective strategy. You're going to be required to act quickly. So the more you can sort of think about the possible scenarios and plan for them and then be prepared to act is really important. We really appreciate all of you continuing to watch this show. We're having a lot of fun with it. We really hope it's valuable. And if you need help, call us. I mean, we will talk to any state anytime, and we're happy to just give you some advice and talk with you about your specific needs. So don't hesitate to reach out. And let us know, drop a line, via LinkedIn or on the YouTube channel about, how you're staying ahead of the curve and what are you doing out there to prepare for all of this, whether you're a vendor or a state agency. But on behalf of Tony, I just want to say thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Vision to Value.